As I lay dying, salt trails warmed my skin. The monastery library air tasted of dust and forgotten ink. I shoved the greying cat from the desk, my knuckles scraping against its clouded cataracts. Say snap. The cat's tail flicked, a dry rasp like fur on stone, and sand spilled from its whiskers into the fresh wound on my heel. It wasn't a grit. It was the twin sensory anomaly, the sand inside my shoes when there was none. I scraped it from my heel, revealing a coin. Said shuffling coins. The sound was a dry, rhythmic skitter against the worn library floorboards like loose teeth rattling in a skull. Clack, clack, clack! Asterisk the monastery mist, thick as cold silk, twisted against the wind's direction, sour as forgotten milk. Morning mist that moved wrong. I ignored the sand, focused on tip calculations for the graveyard shift. Thought $200 minus the moment's toll on my nervous system. The radio on the desk hissed static, a distant growl beneath the thunder that vibrated my molars. Kikara, not thunder. Crowl. The mist curled tighter, coiling like a serpent. Breath. I scraped more sand from my heel, watching it vanish into the worn wood grain. The sand felt heavier now, like wet gravel. Clack, clack, clack. Asterisk the coins in my pocket shivered against my thigh. I pulled one out. The date was stamped clear, 1793. The mist pressed closer, cold and damp, smelling of damp stone and decay. My heel ached where the mold had begun its slow consumption, a creeping numbness spreading up my leg. Clack, clack, clack! Asterisk the coin, his edge dug into my palm. Warm! The mist thickened, curling around the desk legs, its movement unnatural, deliberate. I stared at the coin, his date 1793, and felt the warmth seep deeper, not into the metal but fully under my skin. The sand inside my shoes was gone. The mist coiled tighter. Clack, clack, clack! Asterisk the coin date 1793, glowed, thurind, under my skin. In the monastery library's chill, I pried open the radio with a coin from my pocket. Its edge dug into my thumb, warm and slick like blood, but it wasn't mine. It was from those damn shuffling coins again. The casing yielded with a reluctant creak, revealing mold-encrusted wires that writhed in the dim light like drowned worms. Static crackled from within, tasting of rusted nails on my tongue. I leaned closer, squinting at the tangle of innards. A grain of sand fell onto my palm, tickling like an insect leg. Thunder rumbled overhead, mimicking a heartbeat that echoed in my chest. Lub-dub-dub. The monastery mist pressed against the windows, sour and thick as forgotten milk, coiling around the library's edge like a serpent's breath. I pocketed the sand grain, annoyed by its presence. It shouldn't be there. It wasn't supposed to be in my shoes when I started this graveyard shift. But here we were, another anomaly added to the list. The radio hissed louder static, growing into a distant growl. Grrrr, not thunder now, but something else, something familiar. The mold on the casing shifted, black tendrils reaching out like fingers towards my hand. I snatched it back, knocking over an ancient tome in my haste. It landed with a dull thud, sending up a cloud of dust that tasted of forgotten ink and decaying parchment. The library felt thinner now, closer to the mold's edge. Thunder split the air, suddenly wet and sharp as a gunshot. I flinched, knocking over another book, a journal by some long-dead monk. It landed open on an illustration, a creature unlike any cryptid or beast we knew today. Its body was segmented like a millipede, each segment lined with rows of teeth. Its eyes were hollow sockets filled with writhing worms. I scraped more sand from my heel, watching it vanish into the worn wood grain. The grains felt heavier now, like wet gravel grinding against bone. Clack! Another coin skittered out of my pocket onto the floorboards, joining its brethren in their rhythmic dance. Clack, clack, clack. The radio's growl deepened, resonating with each clacking step as I moved around the desk towards the window. The mist curled tighter, coiling around me like a shroud. It smelled of damp stone and decay, the same scent that clung to my skin after nights spent cleaning graveyards. A single grain of sand landed on my palm, a lone explorer amidst vast emptiness, and for some reason it felt like an omen. But I couldn't decipher what message the universe was trying to convey through these grains of sand appearing where they shouldn't be. All I knew was that something was changing, shifting under our feet while we slept. The radio's growl reached a crescendo, Gera, then stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence punctuated only by the distant drip-drip of water somewhere unseen within these ancient walls. And then, as if on cue, another coin fell from my pocket onto the floorboards with a final twin-clack. The monastery seemed to hold its breath around me, waiting for something or someone, but I wouldn't wait here anymore. Not tonight. Not ever again. In my palm, the French Revolution coin burns like an ember, its edge sharp as a whispered threat. Thunder echoes overhead, a pulse, steady and relentless, as if mimicking some unseen heartbeat buried deep within these ancient walls. I trace the date etched onto its surface, 1793. It is old enough to have witnessed history in the making, yet it feels warm against my skin, alive almost. Oh, my shoe squeaks as I shift my weight. A lone voice amidst the monastery library has hushed silence. But something isn't right. There shouldn't be sand inside my shoe. Not here, not now. Yet each step reveals more grains grinding like wet gravel beneath my heel. It doesn't make sense. None of this does. But then again, when did logic ever have a place in these halls? The library stretches out before me, shadows breathing between towering shelves laden with forgotten tomes and yellowed parchment. The air tastes of damp stone and decay, a scent that clings to my skin like an unwanted perfume after nights spent cleaning graveyards. A chill runs down my spine, not from the cold, but from something else. Something familiar yet elusive, lurking just beyond reach. I scrape more sand from my shoe onto the floorboards. It seems endless, this grainy invasion of reality. Each one falls with a soft thud, swallowed by worn wood grain as if disappearing into nothingness. But they not disappearing, they reaccumulating, an unseen dune forming underfoot, shifting like quicksand beneath me. Thunder rumbles again, a deep growl resonating through the library, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. It feels wrong somehow, this thunder mimicking life where there should only be death and silence. The monastery mist presses against the windows, sour and thick as forgotten milk, coiling around the library, S-edge like a serpent, S-breath. I pocket the coin, feeling its weight against my thigh, a constant reminder of something or someone. We were here first, it seems to whisper. But who is we, and why does this thought send shivers down my spine? The radio sits on the desk beside me, casing open like a mouth filled with mold, encrusted teeth. It is quiet now, too quiet, and I can't help but wonder if it has something more to say, some other transmission from beyond our world ready to spill forth onto these dusty shelves. I move closer to the window, stepping carefully over the growing sand dune at my feet. Each step feels heavier than the last, as if wading through treacle rather than mere inches of grain. But I press on nonetheless. The mist outside seems darker, somehow denser, more oppressive against the glass pane separating us. A single grain falls onto my palm. A lone explorer amidst vast emptiness, and for some reason it feels like an omen. But what message is this universe trying to convey through these grains of sand appearing where they shouldn't? Taby, all I know is that something has changed, shifted under our feet while we slept. The coin in my pocket grows warmer still, a burning ember now, searing into flesh and bone. It feels alive. Like a heart beating wildly against the confines of its cage. Or perhaps it is not the coin at all, but something else entirely stirring deep within me. But I won't dwell on that thought. Not here, not now, not ever again if I can help it, because out there in the mist, something waits. And whatever it is, whatever message these grains of sand are trying to convey, I know one thing for certain, it is not going away anytime soon. I yanked the radio's cord, the sudden snap of violent punctuation mark against the library silence. A black, viscous substance, thick as tar, peeled away from the floor where the cord had been anchored, revealing a network of pulsing thread like filaments beneath. They retracted quickly, disappearing into the floorboards like startled worms. Sand shuffled inside my shoes, a dry, insistent whisper against the worn leather. Coins, always coins. The grains felt wrong, alien. There shouldn't be sand here. Not in this monastery, not in this room, not now. Fuit shift a murmuring echo in the vastness. I tried to ignore the tremor in my hands, the rising knot of something cold and unwelcome in my stomach. Annoyance mostly. A profound, simmering annoyance at the absurdity of it all. Another tug at the radio casing, another eruption of the black substance. It clung to my fingers, slick and strangely warm. I scraped it off onto the floor, where it pooled, glistening under the weak light filtering through the misted windows. A spider leg! I saw it then, a chitinous limb sprouting from the radio's casing, twitching with a life that wasn't its own. It was thin, segmented, and impossibly black, reflecting no light. My hand moved without conscious thought, smashing the radio against a nearby tombstone. The impact was brutal, a shattering of glass and metal followed by a sickening crunch. A high-pitched whine escaped the radio's mangled remains, quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence. The black substance on the floor began to coalesce, drawing closer. A slow, deliberate advance. Thunder! It wasn't a rumble anymore. It was a fritty, a tearing of the air itself, a brutal, instantaneous impact against my eardrums. Pain flared behind my eyes, blurring the edges of the library, distorting the rows of silent, watchful books. The smell of ozone and decay intensified, sharp and acrid in my nostrils. I stumbled, catching myself on a nearby shelf, the rough texture of ancient vellum scraping against my skin. The mold on the wall, previously a subtle discoloration, shifted. It writhed, reformed, coalescing into patterns that were undeniably spiders. Not images of spiders, but something more. A suggestion of legs, of bodies, of eyes. A network of black, pulsating forms, clinging to the stone like a parasitic bloom. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the images away, focusing on the feel of the cold stone against my palm, the grit of sand between my teeth. I ignored the panic. It was a familiar visitor, unwelcome but predictable. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had work to do. There was a logic to this madness, a pattern I needed to decipher, even if the deciphering itself drove me to the brink. I had to find the source, the origin of this contamination. The sand in my shoes felt heavier now, binding my feet to the floor. Each step was an effort, a struggle against an unseen force. The mist outside the windows pressed closer, a suffocating blanket against the glass. It wasn't just mist anymore. It was something else, something dense and malevolent, filled with the promise of something vast and unknowable. A single grain fell from my shoe, landing on the coin still warm in my pocket. It felt like a brand. I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the rhythm of my heart, to anchor myself to the present. The library was a tomb, yes, but it was also a sanctuary, a place of knowledge, of history, of something more. The black mold began to spread, crawling across the floor, up the walls, consuming everything in its path. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. It moved with a purpose, a silent, insidious determination. The scent of decay intensified, a cloying sweetness that threatened to overwhelm me. I focused on the dust motes dancing in the weak light, on the intricate carvings on the tombstone, on anything that would distract me from the encroaching darkness. Another spider leg emerged from the shattered radio. It extended further, a black, segmented limb reaching towards me. I felt a tremor run through the floor, a subtle vibration that resonated deep within my bones. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and the unspoken promise of something terrible. The coins in my pocket burned hotter now, a searing brand against my thigh. It wasn't just warmth, it was a fever, a contagion. I pressed my hand against the pocket, trying to contain the heat, to quell the rising panic. The library seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening. A voice whispered in my ear, a sibilant hiss that seemed to originate from the very stones of the monastery. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet somehow comprehended. It was a language of decay, of transformation, of something ancient and terrible. I looked out the window again. The mist had become a solid wall, impenetrable and black. It felt like a curtain drawn across the face of the world, and behind that curtain something waited. Something vast and unknowable. Something that was coming. The sand in my shoes shifted, a subtle movement that sent a jolt of fear through me. I looked down and saw that the grains were no longer individual particles. They were coalescing, forming a pattern on the floor, a map of some unknown place. And as I stared at the map, I realized that it wasn't just a map of somewhere else. It was a map of Souvenir, of this library, of this world. The spider leg extended further, reaching towards my face. It brushed against my cheek, leaving a trail of cold, viscous slime. I flinched, recoiling from the touch. The whispering intensified, a chorus of voices chanting in a language that was both familiar and alien. The mold on the wall pulsed, its patterns shifting, reforming. It was no longer just a suggestion of spiders. It was becoming something more, something real. I saw legs and eyes and eyes. Hundreds, thousands of eyes, staring at me, judging me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calm, a resignation to my fate. I was a part of this, I realized. A part of this decay, this transformation. I was not an observer. I was a participant. I opened my eyes. The spider leg was closer now. Inches from my face, it quivered, waiting. And as I stared into its black, multifaceted eye, I saw something reflected back at me. Something that wasn't me. Something other. Another leg emerged from the radio casing, then another. Soon, the entire casing was covered in a writhing mass of black. Segmented limbs. A single pulsating eye opened on the radio, staring directly at me. The coin still burned in my palm, not with fire, but with the slow, deliberate ache of a bruise forming beneath the skin. It was a mistake to keep it, a mistake to think the shift's tips would grant me any kind of protection. The brass casing had been warm at first, then hot, then something else entirely, a weight that didn't belong to metal. I crushed it between my fingers anyway, the edges of the coin biting into my skin like a serpent's teeth. The fireplace wasn't lit, it never was. The monastery's hearth was a relic, a cold moor of stone and soot, but I fed it anyway. The coin dropped into the blackened grate with a dull, full-link, the sound swallowed by the silence. I waited. The air didn't stir. The coins in my pocket didn't hum. Nothing happened. Then the heat came. Not from the fireplace, from the coin itself. A pulse, a single, violent throb that radiated outward, a ripple of unnatural warmth against my thigh. I watched as the coin's surface darkened, the brass giving way to something slick and wet, like oil spilled on a hot plate. The edges curled inward, not melting but fretty rotting, the metal softening into a tarry blackened sludge. The scent hit me first rust and burnt sugar. The stink of a struck match left too long in the dark. My fingers twitched. The coin wasn't burning, it was free to unraveling. I leaned closer. The fireplace roared to life. No flame, no spark, just a sudden, violent eruption of blackness, a tongue of shadow licking upward from the grate, coiling around the coin's remnants. The heat was wrong, cold, like the breath of a corpse, but with the weight of a living thing. The mold from the walls, the spider legs from the radio, they all converged here. In this one impossible moment, the coin dissolved into ash, but the ash didn't fall. It pulsed, a slow rhythmic expansion, like the filling of a lung. The blackness in the fireplace deepened, thickening into something solid, a wall of smoke that wasn't smoke at all, but a mass of writhing, segmented shapes, too many legs, too many eyes, all pressing against the glass of the hearth as if trying to escape. The thunder came then, not a rumble, not a crack, a voice. A deep, guttural growl that split the air in half, the sound of something massive and ancient dragging itself across the bedrock of the world. The words weren't words. They were vibrations, the resonance of a language that had no need for speech, just the raw, unfiltered feeling of existence pressing against the edges of my skull. We were here first. The thought wasn't mine. It was an impression, a memory forced into my mind like a splinter under the nail. The coins in my pocket vibrated, not with sound, but with the same unnatural pulse, the same slow, insistent wrongness. The mold crawled from the hearth, not across the floor, not along the walls. It unfolded, a dark, damp stain spreading outward from the fireplace, not in a circle, but in a pattern, a geometry I didn't recognize, something that belonged to a math older than human hands. The air tasted of iron, of old blood left too long in the sun. The cat was nowhere to be seen. It never was when the real work began. The ash was wet. I reached out, fingers hovering over the blackened remains of the coin, the hearth's glass still warm with the imprint of something that wasn't heat. The mold advanced, not quickly but deliberately, a slow, creeping advance like the tide pulling back from a shore. It didn't spread in tendrils. I breathed. The hearth itself seemed to exhale, the stone groaning as if alive, the mold pulsing in time with the unseen voice still echoing in the hollows of my bones. I didn't flinch when the first tendril touched my wrist. It was cold, but not the cold of ice. It was the cold of a grave after the body has been moved, the cold of something that had never known warmth. The mold clung, a thin, wet film that didn't spread but settled, like the first layer of frost on a window pane. I didn't pull away, I didn't scream. I watched as the blackness crept up my arm, Not in patches, but in a single unbroken line, a vein of something that wasn't mine. The coins in my pocket burned again, this time with the heat of a brand, the metal searing through the fabric, the edges of the pocket singeing the skin of my thigh. The cat's eyes appeared in the mold, not reflected, not projected, the mold itself triviformed, the segment shifting, rearranging into the shape of a face, not a human face, but something older, something with too many facets, too many angles. The eyes were grey, milky with cataracts, the same grey as the cat's, the same grey as the mist outside the windows. It blinked. The mold pulsed. The voice in my head laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. The flames turned black. The patterns on the library walls weren't T-random. Not anymore. They'd begun as a subtle thing, a discoloration. ID initially attributed to damp. Now they writhed, a network of black veins like tributaries on a map, branching and converging, coalescing into shapes. I traced one with a fingertip, the mold cold and slick beneath my skin. It felt purposeful, a battlefield. I recognized the formations, lines of skirmish, the staggered advance of infantry, the chaotic retreat, French Revolution, the siege of Toulon. I'd read about it here, in these very tomes, the dust clinging to my eyelashes like powdered bone. The air tasted of iron again, a faint, metallic tang that settled at the back of my throat. The static started low, a barely perceptible hiss. It grew, a loom weaving something unseen, unheard, but felt in the marrow of my bones. It wasn't tea coming from the walls or the floor, but from twin within, the space itself, a pressure against my eardrums. The library's silence, already oppressive, seemed to thicken, to congeal, as if the very absence of sound had become a tangible thing. Thrum. It wasn't tea to sound, not exactly. More a vibration, a tremor in the stone, a resonance that mimicked the weaving. Thunder. It wasn't tea a distant rumble. It was immediate, visceral, a shockwave that rattled the windows. Not a meteorological event. A voice, a growl, low and guttural, that seemed to originate from the walls themselves, vibrating through the floor, up through my legs. It pressed against my skull. A feeling more than a sound, a pronouncement. We were here first. Asterisk, the coins in my pocket pulsed, a frantic internal rhythm against my thigh. I ignored them. I had to. Ignoring was the only thing keeping me tethered. The mold shifted. It wasn't a gradual creep, but a sudden rearrangement, a deliberate reshaping. The patterns on the wall solidified, the lines twisting, merging, forming a face. Not human, not animal. A composite, a grotesque amalgamation of features. Too many angles, too many planes. The grey eyes, cataracted and milky, stared directly at me. The cat, it wasn't Tifoki, the mold, it Tufivold. Wasi, the mold, a face formed from the black, damp tendrils, the segments clicking and shifting with an unsettling precision. It blinked. The static intensified, the weaving growing louder, more frantic. I smashed the radio. The impact jarred my arm, the glass shattering with a brittle frack. The static didn't stop. It merely shifted, a higher frequency whine that drilled into my skull. The thunder split my eardrums, not literally, but the sensation was undeniable, a searing pain that pulsed in time with the weaving. We were here first. Asterisk, the message resonated. A physical force, not a thought. The mold on the wall bled. Not a liquid, but a viscous black ichor that oozed from the newly formed face, dripping down the wall, staining the ancient parchment. The image of the cat rippled, distorted, then solidified, the features becoming sharper, more defined. It wasn't teeth, a projection. It was a fire formation. The patterns on the wall pulsed, the battlefield dissolving, the siege receding, replaced by a single, undeniable truth. 1793 was not a revolution. It was a peak, a zenith, a moment of dominance. Tothers, asterisk, the library tilted, not physically but perceptually. The shelves seemed to lean, the books to slide, the very foundations of the room to shift. The scent of rust intensified, mingling with the sickly sweetness of decay. I braced myself against a bookshelf, the wood splintering under the pressure. The coins in my pocket burned, a searing brand against my thigh, the metal twisting, contorting. I didn't too look down, I could. The face on the wall opened its mouth. Not a physical opening, but a distortion of the mold itself, a parting of the black tendrils that revealed nothing. just a deeper darkness, a void that seemed to suck the light from the room. The static became a roar, the weaving a deafening cacophony. The thunder was no longer a sound, it was a presence, a weight, a promise. We were here first. Asterisk, the message repeated, not in my head, but froofy through me, a vibration that resonated in my bones, in my blood, in the very fabric of my being. The tombstone felt wrong in my grip, the granite cold and porous, not the smooth chill I'd expected. It wasn't the weight that bothered me, but the texture like dried coral or something once living, now calcified. I swung. The impact wasn't the satisfying crunch of brittle glass I anticipated, more a muffled twin thud, the stone glancing off the radio as casing. It shuddered but didn't break. I hit it again harder. A spiderweb of cracks bloomed across the dial, the plastic protesting with a high-pitched whine. The static didn't yield, it intensified. A white noise that pressed against the inside of my skull, a physical pressure, then the thunder, not the distant rolling kind. This was immediate, a concussive blast that seemed to originate fudincidate. The room, not from the sky. It wasn't a sound, but a displacement of air, a vibration that rattled my teeth, my bones, my eardrums didn't pop, not precisely. It felt like they'd been stretched, taut and thin, vibrating at a frequency just beyond the threshold of pain. The library groaned, the ancient timbers creaking in protest, dust motes dancing in the shafts of weak light filtering through the stained glass. The radio flickered, the fractured screen displaying a mess of static, then resolving into a fragmented image, a grid numbers and a voice, distorted, almost subsonic. Asterisk 1793 was our peak. Asterisk, it wasn't directed at me. It was a statement, an assertion, a fact. And then understanding, not a thought, but a sudden sickening realization that bloomed in my chest, cold and sharp. The French Revolution, not a struggle for liberty, a containment, a suppression. We weren't the inheritors of history. We were the trespassers, the invaders. The lie breathed. I hadn't noticed it before, this subtle expansion and contraction of the space, but now it was undeniable. The walls weren't static, they flexed, imperceptibly like the lungs of some colossal beast. The mist outside the windows, usually driven by the prevailing wind, moved 2 feet against It swirling and gathering, pressing against the glass, obscuring the grounds. It wasn't weather. It was a response. My boots shifted on the stone floor, and I felt it. A grit, something granular between my toes inside my socks. I hadn't walked on sand in years. I lowered my gaze, a slow, deliberate movement. The floor was stone as it always had been. But the sensation persisted, a fine abrasive texture against my skin. It wasn't too far now my feet. It was so inside them. The library scent changed. The familiar mustiness of old paper and dust overlaid by something else. A faint, metallic tang iron, and beneath that something acrid, almost floral, but wrong. The mold on the walls pulsed, the patterns no longer resembling a battlefield, but a network of veins, a circulatory system not organic, but constructed, purposeful. The grey eyes of the cat face, the one formed from the mold, followed my every movement. They weren't vacant or cataracted. They were calculating, judging. I forced myself to breathe, slow, deliberate inhales and exhales. The coins in my pocket, the few I hadn't bothered to spend, warmed against my thigh, not from friction, from some internal heat. They weren't pulsing, not anymore. They were vibrating. A frantic, high-pitched tremor. I ignored it. Focusing on the sensation only amplified it. The black ichor continued to seep from the cat, his face, the viscous fluid not dripping, but flowing, merging with the surrounding mold, solidifying the image, making it more real. The face wasn't a projection, it was a reformation. The mold wasn't growing foinon. It was so. The walls, the room itself, and the cat. The cat was a conduit, a vessel. The library tilted again, more pronounced this time. Books slid from shelves, tumbling to the floor with a muffled thud. The bookshelves themselves seemed to lean, as if bowing to some unseen force. The scent of rust intensified, mingling with the sickly sweetness of decay, a cloying aroma that coated my tongue. I braced against a towering bookcase, the wood groaning under my weight, the varnish cracking. The coins burned. I still refused to look. The catus mouth opened, not a physical opening, but a distortion of the mold, a parting of the black tendrils, revealing not teeth, not a tongue, but a void, a darkness that wasn't teeth, the absence of light, but a presence, a weight. The static became a roar, a deafening cacophony that obliterated all other sound. The thunder wasn't a sound, but a force, a pressure, a promise. 40 were here first! Asterisk, the message wasn't heat in my head, but through me, a vibration that resonated in my bones, in my blood, in the very fabric of my being. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of ownership. The floor beneath me shifted, and I felt the grit inside my shoes solidify, growing, spreading. It wasn't sand. It was scales, tiny chitinous scales. The library was shedding, and I was standing in its wake. The sand shifted, a granular whisper against my skin. A betrayal. I ripped at the mold clinging to my forearm. A black, viscous tide receding to reveal. A label, museum quality laminated, stubbornly adhered to my flesh. I squinted. The library, a dim light failing to illuminate the script. It wasn't printed. It was etched into the mold itself. Asterisk invader, Gabriel Green. Asterisk, the word swam mocking me. Invader. The coins in my pocket, previously a warmth, now burned with a furious heat, a localized inferno. I clutched them, a desperate anchor against the swirling disorientation. The sand inside my shoes froze into a ludicrous sensation. A phantom limb, Suvi, intensified a gritty, insistent pressure. I tried to shake it out, to kick free, but the scales, the tiny chitinous scales, clung, embedded themselves deeper. They weren't just on my feet. They were becoming my feet. The cataracts, I realized, weren't cataracts at all. They were bleeding, not blood, but the same black mold oozing from the corners of its eyes, tracing paths down its ancient face. The image imprinted itself on my mind, a searing brand. Krufi were the first. Asterisk, the assertion echoed, not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones, a primal, unsettling truth. The French Revolution, a suppression, not a liberation, a containment. The library wasn't a refuge, it was a tomb. A mausoleum for something older. Something that had been here before. The shelves weren't lined with books. They were ribs, the towering bookcases, the ornate carvings, the stained glass depicting scenes of pastoral tranquility. Schuyler or a Fachadade, a carefully constructed illusion. The air tasted of rust, sharp and metallic, layered over the sickly sweetness of decay. It clung to the back of my throat, a tangible weight. My breath hitched, a strangled gasp. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my chest, choked by the accumulating dread. The sand shifted again, a subtle grinding, a whispering chorus of scales. They were spreading, creeping up my ankles, my calves. The label, invader. It wasn't a random designation, it was a classification, a judgment. I looked around, trying to reconcile the familiar with the horrific. The ornate ceiling, the intricate molding, the portraits of long-dead scholars they weren't decorations, they were hieroglyphs, a language I didn't understand, but instinctively knew was condemning. My hands trembled. I brought them up to my face, examining my skin. The mold wasn't just on my arm. It was spreading, a network of black veins, spiderwebbing across my flesh. I felt a tremor beneath my skin, a subtle vibration, a churning, like something was trying to break free. The coins in my pocket pulsed, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I squeezed them, trying to ground myself, to anchor myself to something real. The library breathed again, a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction. The walls flexed, not subtly this time, but with a visible ripple. The dust motes, illuminated by the weak light, danced with a frenetic energy swirling in patterns that weren't random. They were signals, a language of decay. I remembered the radio, the static, the voice asterisk. 1793 was our peak. Asterisk, it wasn't to boast. It was a lament, a recognition of loss. They hadn't been defeated. They'd been contained, subdued, and we, the inheritors of that containment, were nothing more than a biological infestation. A plague. The scent of decay intensified, overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't just the smell of rot. It was the smell of homecoming. A sense of recognition, of belonging bloomed in my chest, cold and unwelcome. The scales on my feet tightened, binding me to the floor. I tried to move, to break free, but my legs felt heavy, rooted. The cat's image flashed in my mind. The bleeding cataracts, the black mold oozing from its eyes. It wasn't a cat. It was a projection, a conduit, a gate. And I was standing on the threshold. The sand solidified, encasing my feet, my ankles, my calves. The scales multiplied, spreading up my legs, a creeping chitinous armor. The label on my arm felt cold, accusing beta. Asterisk, a new sound emerged from the library. Depths, a low guttural hum that vibrated through the floor, through my bones. It wasn't a sound I heard. It was a feeling, a resonance, a welcoming. The library wasn't breathing. It was Priesingen, a song of reclamation, a song of return. And I, Gabriel Green, invader, was being incorporated into the chorus. The tomb door was a slab of stone that had never known the touch of a chisel's edge. It was Codrain grown, fused from the same blackened veins of mineral that pulsed beneath the monastery's foundations. The cat's claws left shallow crescents in the weathered wood of the trapdoor beneath it, a protest that skittered up the grain like a swarm of blind beetles. I pressed my palm against the stone, felt the faintest tremor, not from vibration but from the thin breath of something long dormant, now stirring. The air in the crypt smelled of wet ash, of embers banked but not quite extinguished. My fingers ached where the mold had burrowed into my skin, not as a wound but as an hooty invitation. The coins in my pocket were still warm, their metal singing against my thigh like a tuning fork left too long in the dark. The trapdoor groaned as I forced it open. The hinges hadn't moved in centuries, but the cat was lighter than it looked. Its body a bundle of sinew and something else, something that torn and folded when it landed. The moment its paws hit the stone, the cataracts in its eyes split. Not like water breaking, but like the slow, deliberate rupture of a sealed jar. The black mold inside didn't ooze, it unspooled, a thick, glistening filament that coiled down its cheeks, across its muzzle, before detaching in a single viscous thread. The cat didn't blink, it didn't flinch. It simply watched as the mold stretched toward the stone, as if testing the weight of its own hunger. The tomb's floor was a grid of flagstones, each carved with a symbol I didn't recognize, circles segmented like the petals of a flower that had never bloomed, lines that weren't straight but wrong, as if drawn by a hand that couldn't decide between left and right. The mold hit the first stone and sun stuck, not like glue, like a magnet. The cat's head tilted, its whiskers twitching in the still air, and for a second I swore I saw the mold tupule itself along the stone surface, tendrils of it peeling away from the cat's face to trace the carvings like braille read by something that had forgotten sight. The symbols flared, not with light but with a fun presence, a pressure that pressed against my skull. The coins in my pocket screamed, not a sound, a vibration, a warning. The cat's tail lashed once, not in fear but in furry anticipation. The mold on its face had stopped spreading. I found something. The stone beneath it wasn't just stone. It was hungry. The tendrils that had detached from the cat's eyes were now fully weaving, not into the stone but twin with it, stitching themselves into the cracks between the flagstones like roots claiming soil. The symbols on the stones pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, as if the entire floor were a living thing waking from a long sleep. The cat's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, not from exertion but from pure excitement. It knew, it remembered. I reached for it. My hand closed around its scruff, not gently, not violently, efficiently. The mold on its face recoiled from my touch, not in pain but in fustest. The cat's back arched, its spine locking like a bowstring, and then it screamed mart, and not a sound, as if... The air in the crypt thickened, not with heat but with toothy density, like breathing through syrup. The mold on the stones ripped free from its face, not all at once but in stages, each strand severing with a sound like wet parchment tearing. The cat's eyes, now clear, two were clear locked onto mine. It didn't fight. It didn't struggle. It simply understood. The last of the mold detached from its muzzle and tripped it into the stone. The symbols on the flagstones flared brighter, not in light but in footy meaning. The cat's body went limp in my grip, its weight suddenly fun-wrung, as if it had shed more than just the mold, the stone beneath it, too closed, not like a door but like a mouth, the cracks between the flagstones sealing themselves with a sound like 1,000 teeth clicking into place. The cat was gone, the mold was gone. The only thing left was the echo of a voice, not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones. You're the invasion. The words weren't spoken. They were spoken. They were stone, into my ribs, into the back of my skull where they burned like a brand. The symbols on the floor pulsed once, twice, and then stilled. The crypt was silent. The cat was silent. The only sound was the coins in my pocket, now cold, now tooled, now tea-dead. I dropped the cat's body. It didn't hit the stone. It sank as if the flagstones had become quicksand, as if the entire floor were a stomach digesting its last meal. The tomb door slammed shut behind me. The stone didn't just close, it sealed. The lock clicked, not from my hand, but from Fute itself, the mechanism moving without touch, without sound. The air in the crypt thickened further, pressing against my chest like a hand. The coins in my pocket stopped moving. The mold on my arm stopped spreading. The itch beneath my skin stopped. The cat's cataracts bled one last time, not from its eyes, from the stone. The mold that had been its essence fine unfolded from the flagstones, creeping up the walls, across the ceiling, into the mortar, into the monastery itself. The symbols on the stones glowed, not with light, but with tried recognition. The cat's agenda was complete. The invasion had begun, and I was the only one left to watch it happen. I hurled the radio into the furnace mouth. The coins in my pocket clattered like dry bones in a tin can. Thunder furshua. The furnace roar, a deep wet crack as timber split, not sound but a physical troy-push against my eardrums. The mold on my forearm stirred, as if impatient. I watched the radio vanish into the heat. Static, fruity hiss-die from the flames. A thin, high-pitched fruity whine that made my teeth ache. The mold on the radio, escasing false D, not with light but with a slow, deliberate furty unfurling. Like a tongue-tasting smoke, it coalesced into the furnace. Its breath. The air thickened, not with heat but with treasure. Like breathing through wet wool. I felt the coins in my pocket shift, their metal teeth scraping my thigh. Asterisk 1793, asterisk the date, the monastery library Fruitoiseau, the mold. The air smelled of ozone and old paper, but underneath, the sharp fungal finrot of the mold, the furnace, foodie, exhaled a plume of smoke. It wasn't just smoke, it puhalesti, the static shrieked, in the heat, then stopped beat-eye. The smoke thickened, forming shapes. Not a shadow of Thufesi. The mold stitched itself from the smoke, weaving the radio as static into the hollows of a face. The eyes were deep pits, the mouth a ragged tear. The mold twimpled, the radio as essence into its own hunger. The furnace she roared again, but the sound was wrong. The crack was now a food-wet, tearing sound from the smoke itself. The mold rippled in the air. Not like a wave, but like a shifting of the smoke, forming the nose, the cheekbones. The coins stopped moving in my pocket. The air held at its breath. I saw the mold stitch, the final thread into the mold, sown thushin hunger. The face to I completed. It wasn't a face. It was the fishy absence of a face, the pucia memory of a face. The mold told the radio as static falling toe. The smoke, and the smoke formed her face. The furnace breathed, a deep wet to inhale. That vibrated the stone floor. The mold twin consumed. The radio was static, and the smoke coalesced into her face. The library fwishu. The mold twishu the library. The mold twishu the invasion. The face in the smoke blinked. Not a real blink, a fish shift. In the smoke, the mold stitched. The final thread of static into the mold, zone twin hunger. The coins in my pocket were cold now. The radio was gone. Only the mold remained. The mold twitwasaw, the library, the mold pidwasaw, the face. The mold twivasi, the monastery. The mold twivasi for evolution. The mold twivasi for fisikindi. And I was the firsty thing at twituathi. The mold sitched the face into the smoke. The smoke held to the face. The face twiswasath, the mold twiswasath the furnace, the mold twiswath the radio, the mold twiswath the year, asterisk 1793, asterisk the face in the smoke stared at me, the mold twi consumed, the radio was static, the mold twa formed her face, the mold twasi, the library, The mold twifu was see! The invasion! The mold twifu was! The only thing left. The mold twas you the end. The mold twas you the beginning. The mold twas you the only thing left. The mold twas you was the only thing left.